What did Harold Bloom think of Blood Meridian's Judge Holden? Well, today we are going to hear Bloom speak at length on Holden, and I will then take you guys through a deep dive analysis of Bloom's thoughts, because I'm sure a lot of you guys have read Bloom's introduction to Blood Meridian in some of the versions of the novel, or maybe you haven't. But it is lacking in clarity and depth surrounding a lot of the major issues. And so if you start scouring the internet and finding Bloom interviews, he sometimes will comment on Blood Meridian or Cormac McCarthy, and you get gems like the one we are going to read today. And what makes Bloom exciting to talk about, at least for me, is that he is a biased individual. He does have hot takes on politics and books, which is so refreshing because there is a beautiful history in American literature of literary criticism and authors taking a stand and reviewing books or even talking crap about books that they didn't like. But in the late 1960s, with the hippie movement and with the rise of MFA programs, all that mentality got slashed. In the profiteering university industrial complex, you cannot tell a student who is paying you a ton of money, hey, you have no talent as a writer. I'm looking at you right now and you have no motivation, you have no stature, you have no intellectual talent or drive to change that. And so why don't you just quit now instead of wasting all of our time? You would get fired. You would be a hate crime, harassment in a safe space, all these different things. Not because the university cares about that, but because they care about their money. Anyway, so Bloom, who rejected the deconstructionists and a lot of the ideas that postmodernism brought to the table, especially in literary criticism, which involved the loss of meaning. And if there's a loss of meaning, it's harder to take these objective stances about books. And because, the argument is, well, that's just your interpretation. Which, when you are comparing a ninth grader's writing with Cormac McCarthy, that argument just falls flat in reality. Anyway, so Bloom was a master of vertical criticism. He wasn't scared to talk crap about books and tear people down when it was necessary, not deconstruct them and make it lose all its meaning or cancel people, but just say this isn't objectively great. But more importantly, he learned the ability to praise, and his 99% of his career is elevating authors that he loved. And that's something that most of us don't do. A lot of people, because of online environments and the literature wars, have become toxic. And instead of lifting up the authors they love and championing them, we are focusing on super meta fights. So I understand that was a long introduction to the quote, but it's one of my favorite things to go searching for just Harold Bloom content and find stuff like this and so many other gems, because he really did put a lot of time in giving interviews to random people and just always talking and promoting literature. So, quote, "Certainly the judge is immortal in the normal sense of age. The kid who was just a kid, a teenager, when he joined the Glanton gang, is at least 45 when he is murdered by the judge. What age is the judge? Nearly 30 years have gone by, and the kid is now in full middle age. The judge would have to be 75 or 80 years old, but he looks exactly like the way he always looked. And clearly he has the power and endurance that he's always had, that terrifying strength. There's that horrible implication, which is very hard to evade, and has got to be taken as deeply hinted, that the judge who opens those great arms to embrace the kid violates him and then smothers him in the muck. That is the way the murder is done. A ghastly moment in its implications, but since the kid is pretty tough himself, it would take preternatural strength, really inhuman strength, to accomplish that. This is an ex post facto explanation on his part, but he says that he's looking for a son. His relationship with the Indian seems to parody the relationship that he wanted with the kid, but the kid from the start evades him. The kid is, of course, remarkably disengaged from his own father at the beginning of the book and seems to have a sure sense that he wants to stay as far away from the judge as possible. The judge has no ideology except blood, violence, war for its own sake. And that is what makes him so astonishing a figure, so frightening and foreboding. I think of the judge all the time, when I read about some Aryan Nation gang armed to the teeth out of the Dakotas or Montana, or the blowing up of a federal building, or some nuts fully armed breaking into a school and opening fire. The United States has two special characteristics, I think, from 1800 to 2000, two full centuries now. It is both gun crazy and God crazy. The American religion is all mixed up with guns. In that sense, the judge can be called the high priest of one version of American religion. So obviously there, Bloom is promoting his idea that guns are the problem. He's taking some loose shots at Waco and Ruby Ridge, which he has before, which obviously involved super crazy people with David Koresh and Randy Weaver, but were gross and tyrannical overreaches by the ATF and the FBI and the U.S. government in general. And Bloom doesn't realize that one of the new gods of America, so we have the Christian nationalists, all the Christians who are God crazy and gun crazy most of the time. But then we have government crazy. We have people who believe in different types of gods, not of religion, but of money, of government. And so, from the outside, when you don't believe in any of that, it is crazy. And so Bloom obviously is blinded here in that analysis because, of course, members of the Aryan nation who are super crazy are Judge Holden, but so are immoral members of any government, including the United States, and the people that execute their orders, which include almost everyone from the top to the bottom. And so him standing there on his high horse is always somewhat irritating when he talks about Blood Meridian. He always has to get that in, that Judge Holden and the Judge Holden energy is the Columbine energy. Which is true, but he acts like that's been asleep in America since 1865 or whenever the end of Blood Meridian happens. And I also don't think that his assertion that the judge has no ideology except blood, violence, and war for its own sake is correct, because the judge is a philosopher. I mean, that's what my shirt right here says, war is God. I mean, he does have a philosophy that runs deeper than just, the little tagline. He is trying to simulacra the world, symbolize it. And let me throw you now into a simulacra of a simulacra. If you want a Judge Holden shirt or any of my Cormac McCarthy shirts, the link is down in the description below. And if you want to join my Cormac McCarthy course and my Cormac McCarthy book club, where we will be reading Blood Meridian like the Judge forever, and at least one other McCarthy novel at a time, then the link to that is down in the description below. If you want to support me and chat with me at my daily office hours, I would love to see you there. And let's get back to the video and make it his own, which goes far beyond just doing it for your own sake, just violence for violence. It's his sake doesn't lead to that isn't the foundation of Holden. He's on the mission to control everything. And a lot of that time that may involve violence, but it involves deception. It could be lust. It could be stealing or any of these other things that we actually see. At the end of the novel, we get a very good example when he's kind of controlling the crowd at the fort with the kid. And Bloom's analysis also misses the idea. So he talks about how the judge being able to rape and beat up the kid means that he has this inhuman strength. And obviously he points out very correctly that the judge would have to be in his late 70s, early 80s at this point in the novel, at the end of the novel, and he looks exactly the same. But we never really get too many glances throughout the novel that the kid is some excellent fighter. Obviously, he can shoot people and he's a warrior and he's, had a history of combat. But Judge Holden, who is 6'7", who is just much bigger than him in general, should be able to take him out without too much worry, especially back in the day before different martial art combat techniques and ideas had really spread. It was just a rock'em sock'em brawl, get someone to the ground, do whatever you can to beat them. But at the end of the Tucson, or during the Tucson scene during Blood Meridian, Judge Holden takes the Tucson meteorite and lifts it above his head. And I've seen the Tucson meteorite, and it weighs over 2,000 pounds. So he would be breaking every single, multiple world records for cleaning and jerking and a shoulder press. I mean, and he walks with it. I mean, he is by far the strongest man of all time. And so what I always ask when we talk about his supernatural strength or his age or some of these features is that when does the supernaturalness of the novel start? Because it's obviously, could be at the start of the novel when we see the meteor shower and some of the mystical origins of the kid, but it's most commonly attributed to right before the Comanche attack when they move deeper into Mexico, and it's almost like an Apocalypse Now or a Heart of Darkness type of situation where things start to move into a fever dream. And, there's that famous line I've talked about before where McCarthy talks about the men being like pilgrims in a void, or like alien pilgrims in a void on Anareta, which is an astrological reference to the Renaissance. An astrological term used in Renaissance in the Renaissancean era, referring to the 8th house, which represents death. And so everything after that does take a more mystical and supernatural turn. And we really get to see Judge Holden at a bigger level, because at the start of the novel, yeah, we see him manipulate Reverend Green, but anyone could, technically do that. And then obviously after the Captain White scene, we splash right into astrology, numerology, tarot, and Freemasonry, which continues almost to the end of the novel. I thought it was interesting that, I would agree that Bloom says that Holden is looking for a son. He's almost looking for a prodigy, because the kid is a false messianic figure. He does fall from the stars. There are many moments with the burning bush and the Ogdawad, the reference to the 12 men, which was a connection to the Last Supper. There are so many different things throughout the novel that show that he's this Messiah, but he's a failed Messiah. He never gets off the ground. And Holden confronts him and says, you need to take a side. That's why he's mad at him. He didn't want to shoot him when he had the 3 opportunities, and he also didn't want to participate with the gang. He ran away. The Yuma massacre was all his fault. And so it sounds like, are they friends, or does it sound like he's more of a disappointing father? He saw him first in Tennessee, then he helped get him out of the jail in Chihuahua City and recruit him into the gang. He does take him under his wing, but the kid doesn't want to step into that role. He doesn't want to kill him. And, and that's the question. What kind of Messiah is he becoming? Because if you read the novel as a Gnostic interpretation, which all the signs are pointing toward, with all the crazy references to 8, McCarthy literally saying the word Ogdawad, which is a Gnostic reference to the number 8, the Anareta thing, all the other things, then he is living on the prison planet. He's living in the Demiurge's creation. And if you believe Judge Holden is the Demiurge or an archon of the Demiurge, then you have to ask yourself, so the kid is the Messiah, and in Gnostic ideology, or really in any ideology, his job is to wake people up through gnosis, through knowledge. But knowledge can go either, toward good or toward evil, toward self-preservation or toward, the enlightenment of others. And so that's just a nice subtle theme in there, that not every Messiah errs toward the more positive side. And you could say a lot of them end up negative. That's one of the biggest themes all throughout literature, especially during this time, in the 1970s and 80s, we have a Dune coming out, even though it originally was published in 1965, but we have the Dune series still going. We have obviously Star Wars and that, and many other things. And it's funny that Dune and Star Wars also have these pure evil people. Darth Vader and Judge Holden aren't necessarily the same, or Judge Holden and the Harkonnens aren't necessarily the same, but they really do embody that same energy. And even though Luke in Star Wars does realize his messianic role, he does balance at the end. He does balance light and dark at some level and confront his shadow and kind of move away from some of the classic Jedi mindsets about being pure good. And that's, and that's why he wields the green lightsaber at the end, the middle of red and blue. And as I've talked about before, every single McCarthy novel features heavy father trauma. And so in Bloom, who is a literary theorist, and, that's something you need to keep track of in every single novel. And okay. And a novelist like McCarthy, who lets a lot of his unconscious out on the page and has these beautiful lines. And when you read his work, you can tell that in every single novel, there is father trauma. And Bloom cleared up a lot of things, because sometimes I say in my analysis as well, in Blood Meridian, the father trauma is that, the kid needs the game, but the kid really does need the judge. And his job is to manipulate the kid to head toward the more negative Messiah side. But the kid stands still. Imagine Luke Skywalker being brought before the Emperor. And he's like, yeah, I haven't been training, man. I've just been hanging out, screwing around for the past couple years, I don't really care about any of this. Conversation would be a little bit different. Okay, well, what use do we have for you? So I think this is a pretty good interpretation, because a lot of us now have the Cormac McCarthy Reddit. There's been so much scholarship on Judge Holden, and I've read multiple drafts of Blood Meridian at the archive. You get all this information that wasn't available to Bloom back in the early 2000s, when literally, I've read almost every single piece of Cormac McCarthy scholarship. And back then it was kind of the Wild West. There really wasn't too much yet. And a lot of it was suspect. And until the archive came out and people really started to get, confirmation on ideas and see what McCarthy was really doing, a lot of it was outdated. So he was right about a lot of things, and I have a massive amount of respect for him. And we will hear a lot more of Bloom on this channel.